She had one plan and $43. That was all Maren Voss had when she walked into the Sulphur Creek land office on a Tuesday morning in October and asked to see the deed her late husband had signed over to Cyrus Bellard 3 months before the funeral. The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers and the particularly careful posture of someone who had been told many times not to get involved in other people's business, told her the deed was a matter of public record and she was welcome to look. He set it on the counter. He stepped back. He found something urgent to do at the far end of the room. Maren read it twice. She read it a third time because the second time hadn't changed anything, and she'd been hoping the third would. It didn't. The signature at the bottom was her husband's, Martin's handwriting, the specific looping M she had watched him make on letters and receipts, and the marriage certificate that was still in the cedar box under their bed. The date was June 14th. Martin had died June 19th. 5 days. 5 days between the signing and the dying. And in those 5 days, he had apparently transferred the deed to 40 acres of the most water-rich land in Garfield County, Wyoming, to Cyrus Bellard, who already owned everything else. She folded the paper. She set it back on the counter. She walked out into the October cold and stood in the street and breathed until the shaking in her hands stopped being visible. She was 24 years old. She had been a widow for 4 months. She had a house that technically still belonged to her, a horse that needed reshoeing, a root cellar she'd spent the summer filling, and the certain knowledge that the man who had arranged her husband's signature on that document was going to come for the house next. She just didn't know when. Cyrus Bellard owned Sulphur Creek the way certain men owned certain towns. Not legally, not officially, but completely. He owned the mill and the feed store and the hotel and 2 of the 3 saloons. He had a financial arrangement with the county assessor that everyone understood and no one discussed. The sheriff, a man named Vance Greer, had been appointed with Bellard's specific recommendation and retained with Bellard's continued approval, and everyone in Garfield County had done the math on what that meant and arrived at the same answer. It meant that when Cyrus Bellard wanted something, he got it. And when he didn't get it immediately, he waited. Because patience was a luxury available to men who already had everything and were simply in the process of acquiring the last few things. Maren had understood this by August. By September, she'd started hiding money. Not the cash from Martin's estate, that was known, documented, probably already itemized somewhere in Bellard's accounting. But the money from the butter she sold to Mrs. Greer at the hotel, the eggs she traded to old Pemberton at the feed store, for credit she then traded for coin, the $2 she'd gotten for the wool she'd sheared and sold directly rather than through the mill. Small amounts. Irregular amounts. Money that moved through channels Bellard didn't own, or at least didn't watch closely. She kept it in the lining of her winter coat, sewn into a seam with a needle she'd borrowed and never returned. $43 in 4 months. It felt like nothing and like everything simultaneously. The morning Bellard came to the house. She was in the yard splitting wood. She heard the horses first, 2 of them moving at the unhurried pace of men who had no reason to hurry. She kept splitting. She had learned, in the months since Martin's death, that stopping what she was doing when Bellard arrived was a form of deference she couldn't afford to give him. Not because it was a strategy exactly. More because the day she stopped working for Bellard was the day something in her would stop. He came through the gate with one of his men, a broad-shouldered hand she recognized as Donahue, who had the particular quality of someone paid specifically not to think about what he was being paid to do. Cyrus Bellard was 51 years old and looked like money, not flashy money, not the ostentatious wealth of a man who'd come by it recently and needed everyone to know. Old money, or money old enough to have taken on the texture of permanence. He was trim, silver-haired, well-dressed for a working ranch county, and he had the eyes of a man who had spent 5 decades calculating what things were worth and had never once been wrong. He looked at her the way he looked at everything, like he was already deciding what to do with it. "Morning, Maren," he said. She set the axe in the block. "Mr. Bellard." He looked around the yard, at the woodpile, the garden beds she'd put in, the fence Martin had been repairing before he got sick. Taking inventory, she recognized it because she'd watched him do it to other people's property, and now it was her turn. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said. She waited. "It's a difficult thing," he said. "A young woman alone. Winter coming." He paused. "I have to be honest with you." Martin left some matters unsettled. "The note he signed in June. I saw the deed," she said. He looked at her then with something that might have been surprise and recalculated into approval. Good. That saves us some time. The deed transfers the water rights and the East 40 to me. That's clean and legal. What I'm less certain about is the house itself, because the house sits on land that abuts the East 40 in a way that raises some questions about the survey. She looked at him steadily. She had been practicing looking at him steadily for 4 months. Questions you'd like answered in your favor, she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The muscular anticipation of one. You're direct. I appreciate that about you. Always have. He took a step toward the fence. I'm not here to make this hard, Maren. I'm here because there's a practical solution that benefits both of us. She said nothing. This was a skill Martin hadn't understood, but that she had discovered she had. The ability to let a silence sit without rushing to fill it. To let a man who believed he held all the cards put them on the table himself, rather than handing him new ones. There's a position at the hotel, Bellard said, managing the books. Room, board, a wage. It's clean work, respectable. I know you have a head for figures. Martin always said so. You'd be looked after. Looked after, she repeated. The hotel manager is a decent man. You'd have no cause for concern about. She picked up the axe. Not threateningly. She just picked it up and set it against the fence and looked at him. In the house, she said. Stays with the property when the survey resolves. Which I expect it will. So I'd give up the house and come work for you. You'd have security. In this county, with your situation, that's not nothing. In this county, she said, and left the rest of the sentence where it was. Bellard looked at her for a long moment. The calculation behind his eyes was visible to her now, in a way it wouldn't have been 4 months ago. She'd learned to read him the way you learn to read. Whether, not because you wanted to, but because your survival depended on reading every shift in the air pressure. Think about it, he said. Winter's coming fast this year. He glanced at the half-split woodpile. You've got time. He turned his horse and rode out through the gate, and Donahue followed without ever having said a word or looked directly at her. She stood in the yard and watched the road until the sound of them was gone. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and thought about $43 and a deed signed 5 days before a funeral. Martin had not been a strong man. She'd known that going in. Had married him at 20 because he was kind and gentle and because her mother had said those things mattered more than people thought. And her mother had been right. He'd been sick for 2 years before the end. A slow defeat that had taken his strength in pieces and left him diminished and frightened, and, at the end, grateful for small mercies in a way that had broken something in her to watch. She didn't think he'd sign that deed willingly. She also couldn't prove it. And in Garfield County, Wyoming, in the year of our Lord 1884, the difference between what she knew and what she could prove was the entire distance between her life and whatever Cyrus Bellard had already decided to make of it. The money in the coat lining was $43. She had a horse. She had a root cellar. She had until Bellard got impatient, which, based on her reading of him, was not long. She started carrying the skinning knife Martin had left in the barn. She wasn't sure what she intended to do with it. She wasn't sure she needed to know yet. The feed store on Main Street was the one place in Sulphur Creek that Bellard didn't own outright. Old Pemberton, who had run it for 30 years with the particular stubbornness of a man who had refused to die or sell, kept it going through sheer, cantankerous persistence and a financial arrangement with a supply company in Cheyenne that Bellard hadn't yet found a way to interrupt. Pemberton had known Martin, had known Maren since she'd arrived in the county at age 8. He was 70-something and went hard of hearing selectively and kept a catalog of every person's business in his head the way other men kept ledgers. She went to the feed store on a Thursday, 3 weeks after Bellard's visit, ostensibly for lamp oil. Pemberton was helping another customer at the counter. She waited. The other customer was a man she didn't recognize. She noticed him the way you notice something, out of place in a room you know well, not with alarm exactly, but with attention. He was tall, lean in the particular way of someone who worked hard in conditions that didn't allow for excess. Dark coat, trail-worn, with the kind of weathering that came from being outside in all seasons rather than from dramatic circumstance. He was talking to Pemberton about a horse collar, something specific about the stitching. And Pemberton was disagreeing with the same cheerful certainty he brought to all disagreements. And the man was listening with a patience that seemed genuine rather than performed. He had a straight-boned face, dark eyes, and the quality of stillness she associated with people who had spent a long time in their own company and made peace with it. He glanced at her once when she came in, a brief, neutral look that registered her presence and asked nothing from her. Then he looked back at Pemberton. She got her lamp oil. When she came back to the counter to pay, the man had finished his business and was near the door, looking at a rack of rope with the focused attention of someone making a genuine decision rather than lingering. Pemberton leaned forward while he made change. "That's Jonah Everett," he said, not quite whispering. "Runs his own line up on the Rattler Creek drainage. Traps, hunts, guides hunting parties in from back east sometimes." He looked at her over his glasses. "Not Bellard's." She took her change. "Not many of those left," she said. Pemberton put his hands flat on the counter. "No," he said, "there aren't." She walked out into the cold. The man, Jonah Everett, was untying his horse at the post outside. He nodded to her. She nodded back. She rode home. She thought about it for 2 days, what Pemberton had said, and what he meant by saying it, and what, if anything, it changed. Pemberton was not a gossip. He'd watched 30 years of things in Sulphur Creek, and mostly kept it to himself because he understood that talking was a transaction, and most things weren't worth the cost. When he volunteered information about someone, it was because he'd decided the information should travel. She filed it away the way she'd learned to file things, carefully, without acting on it too quickly, because the only resources she had were time and attention, and she couldn't afford to spend either carelessly. Bellard came back in November. Not himself this time. He sent the county assessor, a small man named Treadwell who had the permanently apologetic look of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had simply decided that knowing wasn't the same as stopping. Treadwell had paperwork, a new survey conducted by a firm from Laramie whose connection to Bellard Maren couldn't prove but didn't need to. The survey placed the house on land that now officially abutted the East 40 in a way that required, legally, a determination of rightful ownership. He was very polite about it. He was so polite, she wanted to put the skinning knife through the paperwork, which she did not do. He gave her 30 days. She showed him out. She sat at the kitchen table. She took the coat from the peg by the door and counted the money in the lining. $43. She hadn't added to it in 3 weeks because she'd been so focused on staying calm and keeping the house running and not letting anyone see her calculating that she'd forgotten to actually calculate. 30 days. She had 30 days before the house became a legal question that would be resolved in Bellard's County by Bellard's people in Bellard's favor. She went to the barn. She looked at the horse. She looked at the root cellar door and thought about what was in it and how far it would take her. She thought about Treadwell's polite, apologetic face. She thought about the deed signed 5 days before Martin died. She thought about the hotel and the clean work and being looked after. She went back inside and she started planning. The plan was not complicated because complicated plans required resources she didn't have. The plan was, get out before the 30 days were up, take the horse and the coat and the root cellar provisions and whatever she could sell between now and then, and go somewhere that wasn't Bellard's County. She needed one more thing. She knew the drainage above Rattler Creek because Martin had hunted there in their first year, and she'd gone with him twice, had learned the ridgeline and the fork where the creek split and the rough location of the line camps up in the high timber. She knew approximately where a man who ran his own trap line on that drainage would have his camp. She didn't know if this was a reasonable thing to bet on. She knew it was the only bet available. She started preparing. She sold the extra blankets to the hotel laundress for $3 and told the woman she was thinking of going to her cousin's in Laramie for the winter. She sold the copper pots she'd been keeping for good occasions that hadn't come. She sold the extra saddle in the barn to a rancher passing through who didn't know enough about her situation to make the transaction complicated. She didn't sell the skinning knife. By the 3rd week of November, she had $61. It still felt like nothing. She had decided to stop thinking about what it felt like and think instead about what it was, which was enough to go somewhere, maybe not safely, maybe not immediately, but directionally. The morning she left was a Thursday. She'd chosen Thursday because the sheriff did his rounds on Thursday mornings and went to the barber afterward and was occupied until noon. She was saddling the horse in the gray pre-dawn when she heard the back gate. The horse shifted. She put her hand on its neck. She listened. Footsteps. More than one person. the particular cadence of men who weren't trying to be quiet because they didn't think they needed to be. She took the skinning knife from her belt and held it with a grip that was steadier than she felt, and waited. Donahue came around the corner of the barn with a lantern. Behind him was a second man she didn't recognize, heavier with the flat, patient face of someone hired for a specific purpose. "Well," said Donahue. He didn't sound surprised. Just settled the way men sound when a thing they've been waiting for finally arrives. She stepped back. Her back was against the stall. The horse was between her and the door. "Mr. Bellard thought you might be getting ideas," Donahue said. "He's not angry about it. He just wants to have a conversation before you do something that makes the conversation harder." The second man moved to the right. He was cutting off the angle to the door. She thought about the knife. She thought about two men and a lantern and a barn full of hay. She thought about the $61 and the coat she hadn't put on yet, and whether screaming would bring anyone, and the answer was no, because the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile in death. She threw the lantern. Not at Donahue. At the water trough beside the stall. It was a calculated throw. The lantern shattered against the iron rim, and the fire went out in the water, and the barn went dark. Absolutely dark, and in the dark she moved. She had spent 3 months learning every plank and post and tack in that barn, the way she'd learned the layout of Martin's illness, not by choice, but by the particular attention of someone who has run out of other options. She moved through the dark by memory, around the horse, through the narrow gap between the stall post and the outer wall, toward the small door she'd always thought was too low to be useful and had now decided differently. She went through it on her hands and knees. She came up running. She heard them behind her, the sound of men in the dark barn who did not know the barn, the crash of something knocked over, Donahue's voice saying something she didn't stop to hear. She ran for the tree line. It was 100 yards. It felt like a mile. The cold hit her like a door, clean and absolute. And her coat was still inside, and her boots were not made for running, and none of that mattered. She made the trees. She went into them and went sideways. Not straight, because straight was predictable, and sideways was the direction of the creek. And the creek was the direction of Rattler drainage, and Rattler drainage was the direction of the only bet she had. She ran until she couldn't, and walked until she could run again. The cold was serious. Without the coat, she had maybe 2 hours before the cold became a medical problem rather than a discomfort. She knew this, because Martin had told her about it once. A man he'd helped bring in off the mountain. And the specific temperature below which the body started making decisions the mind hadn't approved. She kept moving. She found the creek by sound. She followed it up, staying in the trees, and she thought about the skinning knife still in her belt, and the $61 in the coat in the barn, and whether there was any version of this that ended in her having either of those things, and the answer was probably no. And she filed that away in the part of her mind where she put things that were true and useless simultaneously. The moon was up. It was cold and silver and indifferent, and it lit the snow enough to see by, which was both a gift and a problem, because it lit the snow behind her too. She didn't look back. The creek forked where she remembered it forking. She took the left branch because left was north, and north was high country, and high country was where a man with a trap line would set his camp, somewhere above the valley, somewhere outside the geography of Bellard's reach. She was 3 miles up the drainage when she stopped being able to feel her hands. She kept moving because stopping was the version of this that ended badly. She kept moving, and she thought about the $61 and decided to stop thinking about that and thought instead about Martin's first winter when they'd been snowed in for 2 weeks, and he'd read her every book on the shelf, and she'd beaten him at cards every night, and it had been, in its way, one of the best 2 weeks of her life. She thought about her mother's voice saying those things mattered more than people thought. She found the camp because there was smoke. Not much, a thin line of it, above the tree line. Only visible because she was looking up and the moon was up, and she'd run out of other directions to look. She went toward it with a single-mindedness that was not entirely voluntary, more the body's decision than the mind's. The body having determined that warm was the only relevant direction. The camp was a cabin. Small, dark timber, set against a rock face that cut the wind. A chimney, a lamp burning low in the window. She knocked on the door because she still had that much dignity. A pause, then a voice, even, unhurried. Who is it? Maren Voss. She didn't know if her name would mean anything. Pemberton might have mentioned her once or twice. She'd been mentioned in the context of Martin's death, and the land. She'd been mentioned in the context of Bellard. She didn't know if any of that had reached up this far. A longer pause. The door opened. Jonah Everett looked at her. She looked at him. He took in her condition in a single rapid assessment. No coat, running clothes, 3 or more miles of winter creek drainage on her boots. Hands she was holding against her sides because she couldn't feel them to know what to do with them. He stepped back from the door. She went inside. The cabin was warm in a way that felt physical, like walking into something solid. There was a fire and a stove and the smell of pine smoke and something cooking. And she stood just inside the door and breathed and let the warmth start its argument with the cold that had been winning. He put a blanket over her shoulders without being asked. He poured something hot into a cup and set it on the table. Hands, he said. She held them out. He wrapped them around the cup and held them there, not in a way that was intimate, just practical, until she felt the heat start to reach her fingers. Bellard, she said. He came for the house tonight. Everett sat down across from her. He had the same quality she'd noted in the feed store, that stillness that wasn't passivity but looked like it from certain angles. He waited. She told him, not everything, not the history of it, just the shape of tonight, the men in the barn, the lantern, the run through the dark, the drainage, the smoke. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't do the thing some men did where the listening was actually the process of formulating a response rather than the process of hearing what was being said. The deed, he said when she finished. The one he had Martin sign, 5 days before he died. He looked at the fire. A log shifted. Outside the wind moved through the timber with the low persistent sound of high country winter. You have proof it was coerced. I have suspicion that it was. I have the timeline, and I have the fact that Bellard had been after that land for 2 years while Martin was sick, and Martin had refused him twice that I know of. And now he's coming for the house. Using a survey from Laramie. Treadwell served it 3 weeks ago. I had 30 days. He looked at her. How many left? 8. Outside the wind again. The fire. The small, precise sounds of a cabin in winter doing what cabins do, holding. Donahue will come up here, she said. I want you to know that. If he figures out the direction I went, which he probably will when it's light, he'll come to the drainage. Bellard knows about this camp. He nodded. He already knew. She could see it in the way he absorbed the information without reacting to it. He'd calculated this or something like it before she'd said it. He's not the first man Bellard has sent up this drainage, Everett said. He said it plain, without drama, the way he seemed to say most things. Bellard wants a right-of-way across my northern line. I've declined it twice. So you know how this goes. I know how he operates. He looked at her. You need to sleep. We'll work out the rest in the morning. She almost said something about imposing. She stopped herself because she was cold and had 8 days and no coat, and the dignity of the gesture wasn't worth the energy. All right, she said. He gave her the cot. He took the chair by the fire. She lay down with the blanket and listened to the wind and the fire and tried to let her body make the decisions for a while because her mind was tired. She thought about the lantern going out in the water trough and whether that had been the right move and decided it had been because she was here and not in Donahue's lantern light. And any decision that got you to safety was the right decision by definition. She slept. In the morning he had coffee. She sat at the table and drank it and looked at her hands, which had come back to her overnight and were sore at the fingertips in the specific way that meant she'd gotten inside in time. He'd been up for a while. She could tell by the way the fire was built up and the way he moved around the small space with the ease of someone who'd already done his first tasks of the day. She told him the rest of it, the deed and the survey and the 30 days and the money and the coat she didn't have anymore, and the decision she'd made 3 weeks ago to get out before the deadline rather than after. He listened. He made more coffee. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, Treadwell filed that survey with the county land office. Yes. The same land office where Bellard has an arrangement with the assessor. Yes. He looked at the window. The timber was dark against early light. What you need is the deed itself, the original deed Martin signed. Not the survey, not the assessment, the deed, and a way to challenge the circumstances of the signing. I know, but the deed is in the land office, which Bellard controls. She held her coffee cup. She was aware this was the conversation they'd been working toward, and that she'd started it, and she didn't entirely know where it was going. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I want to be direct about that. I came here because it was the only direction that wasn't Bellard's. And because Pemberton mentioned your name once in a way that told me something. She paused. But I'm not asking you to fight my fight. I'm asking if there's a path out of this county that doesn't go through Bellard's road. He looked at her for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair. There's a pass, he said, north of here. Cuts through above the Rattler headwaters and comes down into the next county. Different jurisdiction, different sheriff. He turned his cup in his hands. There's a territorial land agent in Holt who operates independently of county assessors. If you could get a certified copy of that deed and make it to Holt, you could file a challenge to the signing under duress. How would I get a certified copy? He was quiet for a moment. That's the harder part. They came in the afternoon. She saw them from the cabin window first, 3 riders on the lower slope, moving through the timber with the deliberate pace of men following a track. She'd been watching the slope all morning because she'd known they would come, and she'd decided watching was better than being surprised. Everett, she said. He came to the window, looked, came back from the window and started moving. She'd seen him move with purpose in the feed store. It was the same here, economical, precise, without the particular performance of urgency that frightened men put on. He knew this terrain the way she knew that barn, and the knowing was in his body. 3 men, she said. Donahue is one. The one on the right, I don't know. He took a rifle from the wall. The third. She looked. Treadwell, she said. The county assessor. He considered this. So Bellard sent the law along. Such as it is. He looked at her. Can you ride? Yes. Take the bay. She's steady. He handed her the rifle. Stay at the upper tree line until I signal you. And, if something goes wrong. He met her eyes. Same thing I'd tell anyone. Use your judgment. She went out the back of the cabin and took the bay from the corral and rode up into the timber and waited with the rifle across her knee and the cold around her in the thin afternoon light. What happened on the slope below her happened in pieces, at a distance, partially obscured by the timber. She heard voices. She heard Everett's voice, level and specific, and then Donahue's, louder, with the particular aggressive projection of a man who expected volume to substitute for authority. She heard Treadwell say something in a higher register, then a silence that lasted too long. Then Donahue's horse came out of the timber alone, fast, heading down the slope, and the second man came behind it, and that left 1 horse unaccounted for. She rode down. Everett was standing in a small clearing below the cabin. Treadwell was on the ground, not hurt, sitting with his back against a pine tree with an expression that was entirely composed of the specific humiliation of a man who had gone somewhere with authority and found that authority wasn't sufficient. Donahue's gone, Everett said. The other hand went with him. He looked at the skinning knife in Treadwell's belt, then at Treadwell. You have the deed copy in your coat. Treadwell's chin came up. That document is county property. You brought it to serve to her, Everett said. He said it without particular emotion, which means it's connected to her name. He looked at Maren. She dismounted. She stood in front of Treadwell and looked at him. He was 50 years old and had the eyes she'd seen on Harlan at the store. Harlan who'd watched things he couldn't fix and been sorry about it in a way that didn't change anything. She recognized it on Treadwell, too. He knew. He just had a salary. Mr. Treadwell, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. What Bellard arranged for Martin's signature on that deed. You know what it was. He looked at his hands. You've known for 4 months. You're the one who processed the filing. He said nothing. There is a land agent in Holt, she said. His name is Everett's. She looked at Everett, who supplied a name she wrote into her memory. She looked back at Treadwell. He operates independently of this county's arrangement with Bellard. If I arrive in Holt with a certified copy of that deed and the date of Martin's death and a sworn statement about the timeline of the signing, he'll open an inquiry. Treadwell was very still. I'm not asking you to testify, she said. I know what that would cost you in this county. I'm asking you to hand me the copy you brought up here to use against me, and to let me ride north. A long silence. The timber held it. The wind moved through the upper branches, and the cold settled around all three of them with the democratic indifference of weather. He reached into his coat. He held out the document. She took it. She looked at it once, long enough to confirm what it was. Then she folded it and put it inside her shirt, against her chest, where it would stay warm and flat and retrievable. Thank you, she said to Treadwell. She meant it plainly. He didn't look at her. He got up from the pine tree and dusted off his coat and went to his horse. She watched him go. Everett was already at the corral. The pass he'd described was 6 miles north and 3,000 feet up. And they made it in the late afternoon, just at the edge of light, the horses blowing hard at the top and the valley of Garfield County spread out below them and already small enough to hold in one hand if you wanted to. She stopped her horse at the top and looked back. She thought about the house. The root cellar she'd spent the summer filling. The cedar box under the bed with the marriage certificate in it. The wood pile she'd been splitting when Bellard first came. She thought about Martin's voice reading to her during the blizzard. Every book on the shelf. 2 weeks of cards and silence. And the specific warmth of being snowed in somewhere with someone you trusted. She couldn't go back for any of it. She understood that. The going back was not a version that existed anymore. She turned her horse north. The descent on the other side was longer than the climb. They rode into the dark, and Everett had a lamp and knew the trail, and she followed his lead through timber that smelled different from the timber below, colder and older and less touched. And she let herself be uncertain about where she was, without letting the uncertainty become fear, because fear was not useful, and uncertainty was just the name for territory she hadn't mapped yet. They camped that night where the trail leveled out and the trees opened into a meadow that caught enough moonlight to be silver. He built a fire. She helped. The wood was wet and it took 3 attempts. When it caught, they both sat back. She thought about Donahue riding back down to Sulphur Creek. She thought about Bellard, who would hear what had happened by morning and would do what men like him did, recalculate, reorganize, look for the new angle. He'll come after the deed, she said. Probably, Everett said. But it's not in his county anymore. He turned his cup in his hands, and Treadwell saw you leave with it. If Treadwell talks, and at some point Treadwell will talk because that's the thing about men who know things they're ashamed of, it becomes a record. A thing in the record is different from a thing in a drawer. She looked at the fire. I have $61 in the lining of a coat in a barn in Sulphur Creek, she said. It was slightly absurd to say it. She knew it was absurd. It almost made her laugh, which surprised her. The shape of a laugh without the substance. I know, Everett said. He said it without pity, which was the only way she could have heard it. They sat with the fire. What's in Holt? She said after a while. Beyond the land agent. He thought about it. Smaller than Sulphur Creek. Quieter. There's a woman who runs the dry goods who rents rooms. The land agent is legitimate. I've dealt with him. He paused. It's not a perfect place. There's no such thing. I'm not looking for perfect, she said. I know. He looked at her across the fire. What are you looking for? She thought about it. She'd had months of sitting at the kitchen table, in a house that was being taken from her, thinking about what she would take with her if she went. And the answer had always been the same, not things. Things were already gone, or going. She wanted to wake up in the morning and have the day be hers. She wanted work she'd chosen. She wanted to make a decision and have it be her decision, not a decision inside someone else's larger decision about her life. She looked at the fire and thought about the document against her chest and the $61 she didn't have anymore, and decided that those were problems with geographical solutions, which was the most useful way to hold them. I want to see what this land looks like when it's mine to look at, she said. Everett held her gaze across the fire for a moment. Then he looked back at the flames. They rode into Holt 2 days later on a morning that was cold and still and clear in the way of high country mornings that have decided to be honest about themselves. The main street was half the length of Sulphur Creek's. There was a hotel, a land office with different lettering than the one she'd left behind, a dry goods with a lamp burning in the window. The sheriff was a woman she didn't know, coming out of the hotel with a coffee cup, who looked at them with the straightforward assessment of someone doing a job rather than protecting an arrangement. She directed them to the land agent without being asked for anything in return. Maren sat across from the land agent an hour later with the deed on the table between them and the dates she'd memorized and the story she'd been carrying since June. She told it plainly because she had learned that plain was the only way to tell a thing you needed someone to believe. He listened. He asked 3 questions. He opened his ledger. "There will be an inquiry," he said. "These things take time." She nodded. "That's all right," she said. She'd been patient for a long time. She could be patient in a different direction. Outside, Everett was watering the horses at the trough. She stood in the door of the land office and looked at the street, at the town she didn't know yet, at the territory opening up north and west beyond the last buildings. She thought about Bellard in Sulphur Creek, where his money was, and his arrangements were, and his hotel was, and his sense of himself was, and all the architecture of a man who had spent 51 years being certain that consequence didn't apply to him. She thought about the document in the land agent's ledger, a thing in the record. She wasn't certain what came next. She'd thought in the worst months that certainty was what she needed, that if she could only see the path clearly enough she could walk it without fear. She understood now that the certainty had been the wrong thing to want. The path wasn't something you saw in advance. It was something you made by walking, by the particular stubbornness of continuing in a direction when you had reason to stop, by the accumulation of days and decisions that were yours rather than someone else's. She stepped out into the cold. The street was quiet and strange and entirely unwritten. She pulled her borrowed coat tighter and felt the absence of the knife, and the absence of the money, and the presence of the document in the ledger behind her, and she breathed the cold air of a county that wasn't Bellard's, and she looked at the road going north. She kept looking.